Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Welcome to the second hour of Free for All Friday here on Focal Point AFR Talk, the American Family Radio Talk Network. And speaking of the decline into sexual deviancy, a court in Canada has declared all laws against prostitution illegal. And I haven't read the opinion. I don't know exactly what it's based on. I'm assuming that somewhere in there is they're saying you cannot criminalize conduct as long as it involves consensual adult interaction. That's probably, well, ladies and gentlemen, consent's got nothing to do with it. Immoral is immoral whether somebody consents to it or not. Just because you agree to do it, that doesn't magically make it right. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can agree to do, and they're terrible. You can decide to shoot somebody. You can decide to rob a bank. You can decide to rob a bank with a friend. You can decide to shoplift at a store with a friend. Just because the two of you mutually agree to do it has nothing to do with whether what you are doing is moral or immoral. So you get this whole business about as long as it's adult and as long as it's consensual, it's got to be okay. That's just absolute hokum and balderdash. Just because I agree with you to rob a bank does not make it right to rob a bank. It's adult, it's consensual, but it is still wrong, and consent's got nothing to do with whether something is moral or immoral. You know, Eric Erickson, head of Red State, has got a good piece today. I haven't read it, but the headline grabbed me, and it struck me. There's a parallel. I don't know if he makes in here, but there's a parallel between evil and Islam, which really in some respects are interchangeable terms. But he makes the point that evil is something that is tolerant or appears to be tolerant or claims to be tolerant or tries to pass itself off as tolerant until it's dominant, until it's in control. Then, when it is in control, it silences the voices of good. So when evil is not dominant, it appears to be tolerant. But then when it gains dominance, then it uses its power and its authority to silence the voices of good. And this is exactly what Islam does. That's why I believe we need to do something about Islamic immigration, because Muslims will come into a culture as long as they are in a substantial minority, they don't cause a lot of trouble. But as their numbers grow, as they become a larger and larger percentage of the population, as they begin to accumulate more influence and more power, then it's not long before they begin pressing for Sharia law, Sharia restrictions, special Islamic protections for them in a westernized and Christianized culture. So that was a pretty interesting little observation. Now, let's grab clip number 3, Rob. This is a guy by the name of Wilson Cruz. He's a homosexual activist. And again, talking about this domination, this tyranny, this totalitarian bullying and bigoting impulse that's in the homosexual lobby. Listen to what he has to say about Phil Robertson in this soundbite.
The world is changing, the country's changing, and even the state in which Mr. Robertson lives is changing, and he needs to get in line.
You get that? He needs to get in line. Well, you know what the natural question to ask then is, or what? Or what? What do you intend to do to Phil Robertson if he will not get in line? Now here, clip number 4 is Dan Savage. This guy is a rabid pro-homosexual activist. And he was on Anderson Cooper's program, and they were talking about Phil Robertson. Now, what Phil had done is it was a sidebar in the GQ piece, and he talked about his experience growing up in the South with blacks. And he's just talking about his experience. He's not making any generalizations. He's talking about his own life, his own experience. And he talked about how many black friends he had, how many fields he worked with black laborers. He worked in the cotton fields just like blacks did. And he talked about how happy they were and how they sang all the time and how friendly they were and how up they were. Well, this does not fit the liberal template, because in the liberal template, if that's your color of skin, you have to be oppressed. You have to be clanking around in chains all the time. Your head has to be low. You got to be hanging your head. You got to be downtrodden. You got to be beaten. And Phil's just saying, look, that wasn't true of the blacks that I was around. He wasn't saying it wasn't true anywhere. He was saying, look, in my experience, I'm just telling you what I experienced. I had great friendships with these folks, and they weren't downtrodden in the least. They were up, they were joyful, and they were cheerful. And so Dan Savage wants to try to make that out to be racism. And it's interesting in this soundbite to see the way he slides off of the issue of homosexuality and tries to make it about race. Let's listen.
I actually thought what he said about African Americans in the South under Jim Crow was so much more offensive.
That essentially that they were happy he never heard them complaining.
Right, at a time when if an African American looked funny at a white person, they could be lynched. Oddly enough, he never heard any of them complaining to him about their circumstances.
So for you, those were the comments which you thought were more controversial.
Much more offensive, but this is America, and sex is always what we'd rather be talking about than race or anything else. So the fact that he invoked gay people's rear ends means that's going to be the conversation instead of the really patently offensive, absurdly historically revisionist things he said about African Americans.
And see what Phil Robertson said about these blacks is that they knew God. God was the source of their joy. God was the source of their happiness. That's why there was something different about them. But it's interesting to me the fact that he would slide off of the issue of homosexuality means it tells me that he knows they're losing the battle in the court of public opinion over whether homosexual behavior is normal, natural, something that ought to be promoted. And you realize when Phil Robertson was so direct and honest about what happens in homosexual behavior, what really should happen is if homosexual activists really believe this is normal behavior, it's healthy behavior, it's behavior that society ought to approve of, then they ought to be out making the case for that. This is good. This is normal human behavior. It is constructive human behavior. It is great human behavior. It's good human behavior. It's healthy human behavior. It's normal human behavior. And they're not doing it because they know they cannot make a case for that. One last clip, clip 5. This is Ann Coulter, and she was on Steve Malzberg radio program talking about this whole thing and what this episode with Phil Robertson reveals about the homosexual lobby. Let's listen.
In fact, he puts fornicating heterosexuals on a darker plane than homosexuality. He says you start with homosexuality. From there you go to bestiality, to having sex with this woman and that woman. And look, this is straight Christian, and I might add Judeo-Christian doctrine. Sorry, no fornication. That's what the good book says. And to cite standard morality that has been around for thousands of years, and have this, obviously not all gays, but this angry gay mafia gang up on you and demand your suspension has just gotten out of control. I think this is not good for the gays.
And I agree with Ann Coulter there, and that's the point I made in the first hour. This is not good for them because it reveals them, it exposes them. And again, I'm not talking about all homosexuals. I'm talking about homosexual activists. I'm talking about the homosexual lobby. I'm talking about the people that are pushing and pressing for the homosexual agenda. A lot of gays just want to be left alone. They don't have a political agenda. They don't have a political cause. They just want to be left alone. And the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, we may disapprove of their behavior, and we do, but nobody is going to advocate busting into their bedrooms and hauling them off in chains. Just not going to happen. They keep their behavior behind closed doors. The reality is nobody is going to trouble them. Nobody is going to bother them. But they're the ones that are bringing it out of the bedroom, in the street, forcing it on us, forcing it into our classrooms, forcing it into the public square. And this reveals a dark side to the homosexual lobby, how intolerant it is, how vicious it is, how mean it is. And Ann Coulter is exactly right. This whole Phil Robertson thing is not good for the gays. Focal Point, AFR Talk.